So I went and saw Gladiator 2, and I figured, what the hell? Why not make a movie review? For this, I won't be going into any historical inaccuracies in the movie. More so, I want to focus on the entertainment value and how enjoyable of a movie it was or wasn't. Also, I won't be doing any kind of full plot synopsis in this. I will just very briefly run through what the movie was about. I will, however, definitely be sharing spoilers, so heads up on that. Alright, let's do this thing. I want to start with the actual plot of this movie. The movie mainly focuses on Paul Mescal's character as he is forced into the arena as a gladiator. His primary motivation is for revenge against the person he feels is responsible for his wife's death. Sound familiar? Well, it should, because Gladiator 2 rips the main plot concept from the original. That's not the only storyline, though. You also have Denzel Washington's character, who works to accrue power and influence behind the scenes. As well, you have Pedro Pascal and his wife, Connie Nelson, who returns as Lucilla. Their goal is to work with the Senate and the military to overthrow the tyrannical twin emperors of Rome. Okay, enough plot explanation. Time for my thoughts on the actual plot execution. The problems for the plot start with the movie being a direct sequel of the iconic original Gladiator movie. The first Gladiator wrapped up conclusively, without any real loose ends, and with a really hopeful view of Rome's future, with Commodus dead and the Senate now back in control. So because Gladiator 2 is meant to branch off that story, it has to invent problems. Problems that didn't exist at the end of Gladiator 1, which it does very lazily, and it really doesn't bring much new to the table in the plot dynamic. Ridley Scott basically takes the first Gladiator movie's main overarching goals and then just copy and pastes it for the sequel. It's about revenge and about saving Rome from a tyrant. Well, in this case, two tyrants. That really hurts because we've already seen that story told. And at the end of the original, the climactic conclusion was Maximus unselfishly sacrificing himself to give Rome back to the Senate and the people. However, to start this movie, that sacrifice and powerful moment is just erased, with an opening text sequence saying it's been 17 years since the end of the original Gladiator movie. And since then, Rome has been taken over by two Caesars, who rule Rome unjustly. They never really do quite explain how that happened, and how those two Caesars rose to power. But more importantly, it brings up the question of, why should I care? Like I said, the main plot of Gladiator 2 is the same as Gladiator 1, trying to get the Senate back in control of Rome. But at the end of Gladiator 1, the Senate had control again, and they must have immediately fucked things up really bad because these two weirdo Caesars somehow rose to power. So why should I feel an investment into giving the Senate another chance? Gladiator 2 makes it seem like if the Senate is just put back in power, all will be right with Rome again. But I just don't see how that can be true or possible, when they were literally back in control at the end of the last Gladiator movie. Ridley Scott reusing that plot dynamic just felt lazy and forced. It reminds me of how in the new Star Wars trilogy, it struggled to find its own plot direction, branching off the original trilogy's iconic conclusive ending. Disney solved that problem by just directly taking plot points from the original beloved series and then reusing them for their new trilogy. Like how they lazily brought back Palpatine.
Somehow Palpatine returned.
Oh, come on!
As well, the main character's motivation is essentially the same in this as it was in the original. Ridley Scott chose to do another revenge story for this, which sucks because we literally saw that in the original and saw it much better and more organic in that one. In this sequel, Paul Mescal's character wants to kill Pedro Pascal's because he blamed Pascal for his wife's death. Denzel even makes a deal with Paul that he'll set it up so that he has a chance to kill Pedro Pascal. He just has to fight really well in the Gladiator games. Paul agrees, but then in his first fight at a royal party, he immediately tries to not fight. Then, once he has Pedro Pascal in the Colosseum with a chance to kill him, he just decides against it. Then he gets mad when the emperors order Pedro Pascal to be executed. Paul Mescal's character goes from hating Rome and wanting pure revenge to just being over that because Pedro Pascal had submitted himself to get killed. It really didn't make sense why his motivation suddenly changed. Because after this, Paul Mescal's character is suddenly all about saving Rome, and all about reuniting with his mom, who earlier he couldn't stand. His character arc just suddenly changes. The progression of story in the sequel really struggles in that way. In the original, it felt very smooth. You had a main driver and inspiration, which was Maximus's quest for revenge. But that also merges well with the side story of the Roman Senate looking to take back control from Commodus. In the sequel, it doesn't merge as smoothly, it's clunky. And honestly, I really hated how Paul Mescal's character didn't really have to work up his way through the Gladiator process. He was basically the Bronny James of gladiators. In the original, Maximus had to fight several fights before making it to Rome, which helped you get a sense of just how deadly of a fighter Maximus was. Then once he gets to Rome, it feels like he's in the big show, like moving up from the minor leagues to the pros. In the sequel, Mezcal's character basically only fights some monkeys in a match and then a boxing match, and then boom, they upgraded him to go fight in Rome. Then once in Rome, it's almost instantaneously figured out that he's actually Lucius from the original movie. Spoiler there. Which is another huge miss in my opinion. Why did the Gladiator have to be tied to the original? Why couldn't we just get a new character? It feels cheap and lazy to just shoehorn the concept of Lucius vanishing only to magically return as a gladiator. That's what I mean by too tied to the original. It goes so far as to make Lucius Maximus's son, which I guess they do hint at a romantic relationship between Maximus and Lucilla in the original, but I feel like that just adds unneeded complication to Maximus's story. In the original, Maximus is portrayed as the ultimate family man. His entire mission while at war was to return home to his wife and son, and then after they are murdered, his goal becomes to avenge them. However, with the sequel making Lucius his son, it brings up the question of when was Lucius conceived? Did Maximus cheat on his wife and have a bastard son? Maybe the timeline adds up, and Maximus was able to conceive Lucius before he ever met his wife. I haven't done research into that. But that's kind of hard to know while watching, and it just adds a layer that I feel like just hurts the original, and doesn't really add anything of true value. Other than I guess just to tie this movie to the last movie and to tie this character to the more famous and iconic Maximus one. I will say though, Denzel's character and his arc was a newer story, so credit there. He was an ex-slave of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who used skillful maneuvering to accumulate power and influence. However, his story and rise feels cramped when stuck alongside the revenge plot and the Senate looking to depose the emperors. I feel like it would have been much more effective to tell a story not connected with the original Maximus's. Instead, having the story purely focus on Denzel's character's use of the gladiators to rise up the ranks of power in Rome. Focusing on what Rome could be, like the original, just felt tired and lazy. Let's move on from that. So in all, the plot of the sequel feels bumbling and bloated, unlike the original, which felt clear and focused. Alright, let's talk about the characters. I think Denzel is easily the best character in this movie. Granted, I always do have a soft spot for Denzel, but I feel like you could really see him embracing this role and having fun with it. He plays the manipulator so well, and I think it's a shame his story wasn't the main driver of this movie and plot. He could have slowly morphed into the villain or antagonist throughout the movie. He does kind of do it in this movie, but with those other plots going on, I think Denzel's path to antagonist gets buried too much. Now for the marketed villains, the Twin Emperors. I fucking hated the creative decision that they went with for these two. Ridley Scott essentially took Joaquin Phoenix's Commodus and said, yeah, let's do that again, except with two people, and even more annoyingly weird. Phoenix's Commodus in the original works so well as a villain because he was hateable, but still effective, and even intimidating at times. He felt ruthless, willing to do anything to accrue power, utilizing effective plotting or just pure brutality to get what he wanted. These two are only the weird aspects of Phoenix's Commodus. They never really feel like a threat or in control of situations. They are just two spoiled brat party kids. It felt like Scott looked back on Commodus and thought the weird temper tantrums and the incest were the only important parts of his character. I feel like an emperor who is more ruthless or cunning, or just portrayed a different type of villain than the Commodus emperor would have been much better for this movie. But it felt like they were just terrified to take it in a new direction, and so they made the villains cheap imitations of Commodus. Now for the main character, Paul Mescal's Lucius the Gladiator. Man, this character did nothing for me. For one, he's a retread of Maximus's motivation, but without the memorable lines or impactful acting of Russell Crowe.
Are you not entertained? Are you not entertained? What we do in life echoes in eternity.
Father to a murdered son, husband to a murdered wife, and I will have my vengeance in this life or the next.
They definitely try to give Mescal speeches and epic moments, but none of them land like Russell Crowe's did. They just kind of fall flat. And like I said earlier, they went as far as to make him Maximus's son, and even have him wear Maximus's armor, hoping your love for Russell Crowe's character will somehow transfer over to this new guy, but it really fails. Lucius's motivation is another problem. His path to revenge feels rushed. He goes from farming with his wife at the very first scene to her dying in battle quickly after that. Maximus, on the other hand, had much more build-up until his wife and son died. That helped to grow the tension for the scene when Maximus was riding as fast as he could to save his family, only to show up too late, finding his wife and son brutally crucified. That in turn made the viewer feel angry with Commodus, in sympathy for Maximus, helping you to understand Maximus's motivation on a more personal level. There was very little time to get acquainted with Lucius's wife, so I can't really say I felt anything when she died. As well, because the first Gladiator movie already did that revenge story, this movie just felt like a rehash from the start. Then once Lucius begins his gladiator journey, he immediately falls into the reluctant warrior trope. In his first fight in Rome, he tries to get the other fighter to agree to not fight for the Emperor's entertainment. And that was after he made an agreement with Denzel that if he fought well enough, he would have his revenge against Pedro Pascal's character. What did he think was going to happen if the two fighters just stopped? The emperors and the Roman people would just realize the error of their ways? Paul Mescal's character at this moment is supposedly only focused on revenge and reuniting with his wife in the afterlife. And yet, when given the opportunity by Denzel to accomplish that former goal, he immediately resists. It just doesn't make sense.
'Cause fuck 'em, that's why.
Maximus did start out to be reluctant to fight, so maybe that's why they wanted Lucius to do the same. Surprise, he is his son after all. However, whenever Maximus got into a fighting situation, he was far from reluctant, while Lucius just seemed to be delusional on how he was going to accomplish that whole revenge thing he was addicted to. Even worse than that, Maximus felt like the ultimate fighter and warrior. You really got a sense of him as a deadly weapon in the arena. He could use brute force or smart strategy to win. Lucius, on the other hand, just kinda sucks at fighting, to be honest. Sure, he bites a monkey in that first Gladiator fight, but then every fight after that he's in, he never really dominates. Hell, in his first fight in the Colosseum, the Rhino guy had him to the point where the crowd was deciding Lucius's fate. He really only survives that because of the help from the other gladiators. Then, when Lucius fights Pedro Pascal, he straight up loses, to be honest. Like, actually just gets beat down. And that is supposed to be his big revenge fight. Pascal giving up is the only reason the fight ends. And he gives up purely because he doesn't want to kill his wife's son. But the absolute irredeemable worst fight of all was Lucius's fight with Denzel. In the original, Ridley Scott did a masterful job with the final battle between Maximus and Commodus. In a one-on-one fight between those two, you would be weakening Maximus's power and prestige if you made him fight Commodus and barely win. After all, Maximus is supposed to be this great warrior, while Commodus is just some spoiled, sheltered emperor. However, they fixed that by having Commodus rig the fight in his favor, by stabbing Maximus before the fight, forcing Maximus to basically fight while he was near death. That is such a great way to level the playing field, while still making Maximus's victory feel impressive. In the final fight of this movie, Denzel and Mezcal's characters just fight a normal fight, except the advantages are against Denzel. For one, he's almost 70 years old, fighting someone roughly 28 years old. For another, Denzel is wearing a robe for the fight, while Mezcal's Lucius character has full armor. And guess what? Denzel still kind of kicks Paul's ass. If Mezcal's armor didn't hold up while he was being stabbed underwater, he's dead. That really makes me question how good of a fighter he actually is. For a movie like Gladiator, I really shouldn't have to question if the protagonist got lucky when he had most of the advantages in a fight with a 70-year-old man. Alright, moving on from Paul Mescal's character. Now I want to focus on Pedro Pascal's character. I don't think he's bad in this movie. I just feel like he's underutilized. It's probably because this movie had so many characters and plots going on all at once, Pedro got sidelined, which is a shame to be honest. He's a really good actor, and I think he did the best with what he was given in this. So I can't really talk much more on that because I just don't feel like he's in that much of it. The final characters in this movie I want to discuss, if you can even call them characters, are the other gladiators. In the original, Maximus bonded with the other fighters, like Jaimin's and Muller's characters. I hope I pronounced those two names right, I'm sorry if I didn't. You really felt a bond between these fighters grow through their shared battles and hardships. In the sequel, there are several gladiators who are consistently with Mezcal's Lucius, but it doesn't really feel like they're fleshed out at all. They get very few speaking lines, and nothing that really makes them stick out as characters, like in the original Gladiator. And that's because I don't think the movie ever really wanted to focus on the whole gladiator aspect, which sounds ironic, I know, and is a big miss in my opinion. Finally, let's discuss the action scenes. For any blockbuster movie like this, the action is usually one of the biggest draws. I won't say Gladiator 2 has bad action sequences. A couple of them stand out, but they feel kind of short and over way too quick. The opening battle is an example of that. It looks so cool to start, but then it ends pretty abruptly. Never able to come close to the original Gladiator movie's opening battle scene. That one featured great anticipation for the actual battle and a sense of epicness once it began. The other standout battle I want to mention was the boat battle in the Colosseum. That was definitely pretty cool, even if the CGI sharks were a little wonky. However, overall, most of the gladiator fights in this movie don't really awe you, and there's not an action sequence in the movie that really blew me away, making me want to watch it again and again in the future. Compare that to the original Gladiator, which had the opening battle scene, Maximus's first several fights, the chariot battle in the Colosseum. I could go on and on about all of the different fight scenes in that movie that truly stick with you after, that you'll watch again and again and still enjoy. If the plot of your movie is going to be muddled, you need to at least save it with cool action sequences. But unfortunately, Gladiator 2 was really never able to achieve that. Alright, time to bring this whole rant to an end. I know I've complained a lot, but overall, this isn't a truly awful movie. Gladiator 2 never ventures into that Napoleon territory of truly unwatchable misery, but it does drag on. It does have an over 2-hour runtime, and I cannot imagine a scenario where I would ever choose to watch this movie again, and so I'm going to have to give it a 5 out of 10. Gladiator 2 brought very little new or interesting to the table. It felt scared to move on from the original, stealing the main plot points of revenge and returning Rome to the people. The ghost of Russell Crowe's Maximus in a much better Gladiator movie haunt the sequel throughout. If you haven't seen it and are a big history fan or a big Rome fan, I just recommend waiting for it to come out on streaming. You can give it a watch there and you don't have to spend your hard-earned money on it. But if you're just dying to see it, it's not going to be as bad of an experience as, say, like Napoleon. I really didn't like that movie. I do love Ridley Scott movies, or at least in the past I have, Black Hawk Down is far and away my favorite movie of all time. But it just feels like with this and his Napoleon movie last year, that his days as an elite movie maker are just over, which kind of sad. Well, thank you for watching. If you disagree with my opinions, that's okay. Everybody has different tastes in movies. Lord knows there are plenty of movies that I love that are pretty universally hated.